how can there be, and what is actually taking place when somehow that what is the background of all experiencing forgets itself. How can that happen, that what holds everything, what is all there is, suddenly in a mode of forgetfulness? So in other words, we speak of memory here in its all-encompassing aspect, not just pertinent to what I have retained, what I have remembered or not, what have been retained by my faculties and what have somehow withered away. And this is also how it is linked to this very, very processes of expansion and unfoldment of consciousness. Carl Jung, in his famous seminars on Kundalini back in the 30s, spoke somewhere about this, what happens in and during profound spiritual experiences. And of course this was all learned from his interest in tantric tradition, and when he laid it out, when he presented this very, very groundbreaking seminars on Kundalini, there is this, but they're not passages because they were transcribed, these are these deliveries that what happens in the process of so-called ascent, what happens when Kundalini unfolds and reaches certain regions which is accompanied by profound experiences or very subtle experiences. And then, by virtue of the slippery nature of that process, Kundalini subsides or even goes down to the state of repose or homeostasis even. What happens in those cases? And Jung suggested that based on what he had gathered, what he had learned in his days from the material and the sources he was exposed to, that it doesn't matter, because as long as Kundalini, which is our consciousness here in a contracted state, which enjoys this sense of individuality, wherever height it reached, it leaves the sediment, as it were. So whatever level which is pertinent to any of these spiritual experiences, to how high the ascent took place, leaves the sediment in the psyche and cannot be simply dismissed or waned on the account of its no longer being one's present experience. So his suggestion was that it's not even to the degree of maintaining the intensity or the visceral nature of the experience, but as it leaves the level, as it marks a certain level, it leaves the sediment, even if consciousness bound to subside. It's an interesting observation and a very valid to us, because it kind of brings not so much re-evaluation but a reassurance that these experiences, though may be fleeting ones, they somehow instruct us at the deepest level of our psyche of the potentiality of who we are in essence, right? More or less. This is what Jung was alluding to when he spoke about all these stations of the ascent. He didn't speak about it in terms of stations, that's the term I use since the Tantric Christ retreat, that term, right? Stations, because with the affinity to the Christian tradition of the stations of the cross. And some of you remember, here in the room, maybe not many of you, but certainly some of you remember that that's what we spoke about. We brought the analogy into the Western tradition, into the Christian tradition, and examined each station of the cross in relation to the spiritual anatomy of the ascent of consciousness. But of course, we also know that Jung wasn't an adept. He wasn't even a practitioner of Tantra. So all this was more spoken of from that position of a scholar, a pandit. And these were very useful, very helpful pointers. I suggest that the picture is actually in reverse, that the perspective that Jung gave was colored by individual experience, individual point of view. The vintage point is individual perspective. Whereas in fact, there's no such thing as spiritual experience leaving a sediment in a psyche in terms of how high consciousness has ascended, in terms of what that brought about, but rather in the self-revealing nature of the process. So it's the other way around. It's not that the consciousness ascends and marks the point of ascension with these heights of experience, then necessarily subsides, and we live in the memory of that experience that somehow instructs us that that's how things are. I do recall that. This is a very, very individualized perspective, if you will. What happens, on the other hand, is that this all already contained within one's awareness, within everyone's awareness. All this knowledge is contained. This knowledge, whether this comes from simply tapping into something or having this direct spiritual insight, whether it's in meditation with eyes open, whilst walking, whilst cycling, whilst doing anything, whilst going about one's daily duties, or whilst in a creative process, whilst daydreaming, it doesn't matter. What happens is that that knowledge is simply revealed within, and that is applicable to any spiritual experience. Any spiritual experience, in essence, is precisely that. Whether it's a glimpse or full blast, this is on the account of self-revealing nature of knowledge, which is already in full possession of your own awareness. Your awareness possesses that knowledge and nothing else, no one else. So, memory here is spoken slightly from a different point of view, or from a different vintage point. It's not what we have experienced as individuals that we retain then in the memory, but rather that what is the background of all experiences simply revealed the essence of how things are, what this is all about. And that may then immediately being incorporated into the current structure of still what individuality here does. It's simply, if you will, usurps every experience. And we're not going to now lament or somehow belittle that, because that's also very deeply in the nature of consciousness. So that aspect of, if you will, repossessing taking place on the account of the fact that consciousness here functions in a localized manner in human organism through human nervous system. So it's almost, if you will, the mechanics of creation requires that no matter how profound is the experience, no matter how expansive that experience need to be bottled in again into the confinement of individuality so that can be continuously lived. Otherwise, I just welcome you to simply ponder on, what if that vastness will be given onto me? That vastness will simply annihilate this organism. It's like running the voltage through a bulb which is not wired to carry this. It's as simple as that. We can even find these allusions in scriptural references. In the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna was given the most profound discourses, right? He was given this yoga, and then that yoga, and then that yoga. All the yogas almost are given. Still, I want to know, like, all this you're saying, yes, it's absolutely fantastic, it's fabulous, but hey, how do I know that's true, man? Oh, Krishna. Okay, you want to see me in my full glory? Here, behold. And then we have this extraordinary display of what, Krishna's nature in its full glory. Of the poets, rishis, command of the language, of the magnificence of the Absolute. And Krishna's earthly form is, of course, dissolved. There's no Krishna, there's no human being standing next to Arjuna. So what Arjuna is now beholding, he's beholding this, what now, in a split of a moment, can melt his own existence. So he then begs Krishna to take his earthly form back. He begs Krishna to take this form back out of compassion, because he sees that he cannot withstand that. The magnitude, the luminosity, the sheer brilliance, overwhelming brilliance, leaves no room for Arjuna's existence as an individual being. So that has another subtle here, and in a very beautiful way, how the scripture here conveys this very, very nature of the ultimate spiritual experiences. And of course, and just as Arjuna realizes and beholds in that magnitude and magnificence of Krishna's brilliance his own self, then Krishna takes back his earthly form, and from there on there is no doubts left in Arjuna's heart whatsoever, because he directly beheld the magnificence of his own self. But this magnificence is overwhelming. So it would need to be contained in this and throughout this human physiology. So we bring this as an example, just as that reminder of what spiritual experiences are in essence. And the memory here is not so much in relation to what we have retained. It's simply being then reabsorbed, if you will, into the individual structure, which, if you will, in that algorithm of continuous exchanges, of continuous permutations, affords the possibility of having that relationship intact. Otherwise, we could conclude that the ultimate process of self-realization would have to be at the expense of the physical organism. It's as simple as that. But that is not the case. That is not the case. And why that is not the case is because it is precisely in the human organism, here, within the domain of the nervous system, within the domain of this neurophysiology, that the most magnificent and the most simple things, because these are synonymous here, because this is what the process of self-realization brings about. The simplicity and everydayness and magnificence are here infused. So there is no grandiosity in leaving the exalted state. In fact, it's simply measured from there on by degrees of subtlety. Degrees of subtlety. These degrees of subtlety of perception. In the ensuing phases, in the intermediate phases, it can be accompanied by visceral and jolting breakthroughs. And even that is because nervous system is not yet cultured enough to vibrate in such high frequency. But as soon as the nervous system begins to get into more and more and more tuned state, then we find that it begins to reverberate and vibrate in unison with the finest frequencies, which then simply translate into the way we perceive reality at this gross level of physical manifestation. And everything is then has that magical touch, even as the language goes here. The touch itself is no longer just a touch. Any sense perception has this very, very different quality to it. But because it's so subtle, and sometimes it eludes us, what's the difference? I remember when I used to come out of this prolonged states of absorption, and when you come out of, let's say, the phase when there's this bliss just takes over with such intensity, then in fact reality is almost slightly rendered. It's like what's happening on the inside overwhelms the perceptual capacity. It doesn't even matter what happens on the outside, because we revel in that inner brilliance of that bubbling, that foaming, streaming, fountaining sense of bliss. But that is not necessarily the state of affairs on an ongoing basis. What begins to happen, something interesting. It's that bliss begins to get, if you will, spilling over and leaking into the apertures, leaking into this, what the perceptual capacity here, which is the whole organism as we know it. And the experience is then not so much about what I feel inside, but how that, what's experienced on the inside and what is experienced on the outside begins to merge. And this is where, if you will, the real thing, the real deal begins to happen. Because ultimately speaking, our job is here to reconcile that creative tension between subject and object. Between the subject, which is the authorship of all our experiences, and the object as that object of our experience, whatever that happened to be. So when coming out of these states of meditation, everything is the same. Like, let's say, this, whatever is available in this window of that frame. You go into that state and you come out of it, it's the same, but it's not the same. It's as if it's recreated. There is the sameness, but it's not the same. There is this subtlety of freshness. It's been recreated. it has this something which is very, very difficult even to talk about, to describe, because we don't even want to give it a definitive description because it's so elusive. But all of you already know these experiences, undeniably. Undeniably, there's no way that it is not available to you. It is available. It's like the most, if you will, common example will be when throughout the day you had this, going, and then you suddenly had this moment where you had the possibility for that quick, short nap. That little restorative nap, not this, long siesta sleep I'm talking about, but like those 10, 15 minutes of nap. And you come out of that and everything seems to be refreshed. It's like there's a reset button. But that isn't compared to that experience which does not necessarily carry in itself these visceral elements of transcendence. But in the process of awakening and transformation, whenever we go inward and whenever we go in, then coming out of that always brings about that sense of rebirthing, renewal of the perceptual capacity of how we experience the world. And this should not be forgone. This should not be just sort of dismissed, because a lot of very interesting and important thing happened there. Very subtle thing happened there. Because this is where the rupture between the observer and that what is being observed, between the object of your observation, has a different, if you will, energetic resonance. You can notice that you can examine the state of your own, if you will, awareness to the degree with which that tension is playing itself out. When you feel this visceral rupture as the experience of reality and the object, whatever that object is, your thought, whatever you perceive through the senses, feeling, anything. If you feel that visceral rupture, that means that consciousness is surfaced. The consciousness is really surfaced. It's really rendered asunder into this dual state of subject and object. And whenever that is in a different state, whenever there is a less pronounced me and others, this and that, then there is much more luminosity in that experience. Therefore, in Tantra, particularly in Kashmir Shaivism, it is very well known that everything takes place in the relationship between subject and object. The whole yoga is a reconciliation of that creative tension. Not that that creative tension will cease to play itself out, because that is an ultimate state of affairs. And of course, we welcome that wholeheartedly when that takes place. But then there are phases of what we spoke just earlier, when, because of the necessity and because the way we are kind of wired, if you will, for this localized experience, the subject and object will have its reign. Therefore, it is in the culturing between the two. Above all else, in the culturing within the domain of thought. And it's also where it is the most difficult. Because every thought we think stands here and presents itself as an object of our thinking, isn't it? As an object. Every thought here is an object. It's easy to speak about an object in relation to an act of seeing. I'm seeing a cushion, I'm seeing a landscape, I'm seeing a man, I'm seeing a tree, but a thought is an object as well. And when the thought presents itself in whatever varying degree of intensity, then this is where that polarization is in a much, much, much more tricky way of how it correlates to that state. Because very quickly we come out of that balanced state of plenitude, because it just moved as a pendulum, and it almost seems impossible to find that equilibrium. But noticing it, especially what we just spoke earlier, noticing that novelty of experience, because one can catch oneself in that novelty of experience in any of the intensity of that experience. Because once the experience takes over, it gobbles our awareness completely. And we then revel in that experience at the expense of being aware of what's going on. Whereas if we pay attention to this recreated aspect of reality, then any so-called negative state has a novelty to it. It's like you get, for example, out of whack and suddenly feel completely angry because frustrated. If you pay attention to the novelty of that experience, then you are, if you will, in a driving seat of that experience. Because you have created that reality. You are behind the, if you will, the lens. Or you're the one who holding the brush, you're the one who holding the pen. But if the experience takes over immediately, and we revel in the experience itself, then it's almost nearly impossible, because then it's only the fragmented reality we're dealing with. Therefore, this, taking us back to the nature of spiritual experiences, what is, and how this is related to the memory. What is happening in the memory? Who is remembering what? So, memory here is spoken of as an ultimate asset. It is the memory of the whole. And that memory is the background where all experience takes place. So that kind of memory doesn't come and go. That kind of memory is not subjected to the individual, if you will, capacity to hold it or not. Because if that was the case, then that would essentially mean that consciousness, our awareness, can be usurped or can be eclipsed. But by what? What can it be eclipsed by? What can be eclipsed? How can the self be eclipsed? There's only the self. In the localized picture, yes, it may be eclipsed, but it doesn't mean that the light of the luminosity is somehow ceased to be. Every experience, including the experience of not knowing, is illumined by the power of awareness. So this is, if you will, the hidden aspect that what appears on the account of not knowing itself, already illumined by nothing other than luminosity of one's own self. So this is in addition to the discourses on the fivefold nature of oneness. This is in addition to the discourses when we keep going back to the 5 faces of Shiva, right? The 4th and the 5th, right? The light concealing, the so-called grace concealing and grace revealing power. It is within the domain of your own awareness to conceal its own nature from itself and to rediscover it again. And that aspect of rediscovery is, arguably we could say, and how it is often given different stab by different traditions, different perspectives, for a playful sport that consciousness likes to enjoy, just whatever the reason. Maybe boredom is one. So in other words, it's not so much in the process of awakening and ascent of how we experience higher states of consciousness, or how certain spiritual experiences highlight something and then we retain in our memory, but rather the full gamut of all experiences is already here. Already, reality in its fullness is here at all times. At all times, with no exception. It does not come and go. And it's on the account of self-revelation. Soon as something opens up, unveils, then it presents itself. This is, if you will, a correct way, a correct inference into the nature of spiritual revelation or any insight. It doesn't come because we configured something. It doesn't come because we suddenly got something put together somehow. Now it begins to make sense more than prior to that. It is still within the domain, if you will, of the mind's propensity to organize information. But the spiritual insight is sudden as a flash of a lightning and self-evident. And that is the proper way of how this illumines the reality. And ultimately, for some of you, it will present itself in that manner. If there is intensity, it will be in an intense way. If there is placidity about it, reluctance about it, it will be in that way. If there is anything in between these poles of extreme, it will be precisely where that is located in that wide spectrum of possibilities. For those who are more intense, spiritual revelation will be intense. For those who are completely placid and really, consciousness will be as pussyfooting as you would like it to. So this is the understanding. Why? Because the dialogue is not taking place between Arjuna as one being and Krishna as another being. It takes place within one being. Krishna and Arjuna is one being. Facets of one being, or not even facets, the poles of one being. The ultimate and the relative. Arjuna exemplifies the non-self, the fictitious character, which Krishna enjoys for his own sake. It's the self-dialogue, always. It's a self-dialogue. And at a certain point, that self-dialogue spurs this when the intensity of self-revelation presents itself. But often spiritual seekers, when they read the accounts and hear stories of this, that, and why to someone it happens like that, and this is precisely why, because it happens at the capacity and at the degree to which and with which that is being brought about. Because it's not brought about from the outside. It is always an internal affair. Always an internal affair. So, this is something for you to wonder. This is something for you to wonder, ponder, to contemplate on that on your own, because it can only be done on your own, truly. Because this relationship with the self is the affair which is only pertinent to yourself. So even in the cases of when there is this, well, I've done my work, I've done what I could. I've tried everything, now please take care, like, God have mercy. I've done all I could, now please take mercy. Or just take care of me. Or this is still on the account of self-referral nature of everything. Or, no, I'm going to do it all myself. I'm going to take the bull by the horn. I'm going to ride that. I'm going to do it. It's the same thing. It's absolutely the same thing. There's no difference. Therefore, we bring about this reconciliation. Because we can jump into some ready-made assumption, extreme. There are those who say that everything is possible. Everything is possible. You're the master of your existence. And that is true. And those who say, who is there to make any decision? All this is the will of the Almighty, the will of the Divine, one and the only. Ours is only wishful thinking. That is also true. But how that relates, only you know. No one else knows. No one else will never know. And if you don't know, no one else will ever know. This is because you are all there is, because I am all there is. It's the hearing of the ultimate truth. It's not blasphemy, it's not denial of Ishvara or the aspect of God. Please try to understand that. Because for some of you in whom religious sentiment vibrates at the level of the DNA, this may come across as the very audacious perspective or proposal. And for some of you, this may be also backed up by direct experiences that there is the Almighty, that there is this greater power than myself. Still, God, or any notion, or any thought of God, is nothing but an object for a subject of your contemplation. So in other words, God, by virtue of ultimate ways of how things are, is that what creates the duality of the subject and object. So therefore, there is this understanding, there is this perspective shared by many scholars that in more ancient forms of spirituality, there was no God. It's a kind of, it's something as a concept that evolved with time and entered even the most, if you will, monistic oriented of traditions. Just as it entered also the culture which we know now in relation to what was born in Indian subcontinent as in that richness of forms of relating to the divine. But if you go to the earlier Upanishads, all of them were, without exception, non-dual in essence. And the aspect of individual God is something else, the Ishvara. That Ishvara is that Sanskrit term which stands for the individual relation, that Ishtadevata we spoke about, right, many times. It's that individual relationship, your own unique form of connection. But to speak of God as ultimate reality, it cannot be spoken outside of one's own awareness, because that immediately betrays the very essence of who you are. In fact, religious admonition is the betrayal of that very, very fundamental principle. And of course, it is accompanied by a lot of, well, if one is psychologically strong, if one's ego is fully developed, then there is nothing more freeing, nothing is more liberating. But if one is still if you will subject it to certain distorted perspectives here, then that perspective is unacceptable. Why? Just think about it for a moment. Why that is? And the answer is very, very simple. The answer is very straightforward. Because there's no one left to blame. There's no one left accountable. Because ultimately we want to have someone who is accountable. Someone has to be accountable. Ultimately, at the highest hierarchy, there has to be someone to whom we can assign it all. But in this perspective, there's no one else left. Therefore, this is the perspective for mature psyche. And that maturity is required, it's a prerequisite. Because otherwise, it will always stumble and it will prefer to have this rendered perspective, because one will find greater comfort in that. And we can also see that there is also how some traditions were trying to reconcile that, how these traditions were trying to reconcile that. But most of you remember, whenever we spoke about the dyadic relationship, represented by the pure categories of Shiva Shakti, then there is no superiority, no inferiority in that relationship. In fact, Shiva is Shakti, Shakti is Shiva. And the world and the creation is the form of Shiva, which is Shakti. So reality is already in a perfect state of union. And it cannot be separated here. This is the beauty of the monistic philosophy. This is the beauty of this non-dual Tantra, because it left no room for speculation. There's no speculation left on the philosophical grounds. Everything is nothing other than awareness, and everything is made out of awareness. Everything is made, gross, subtle, causal, transcendent. Everything is made out of awareness. Everything is made out of the same stuff. And that memory is carried at the cellular level. So our job is to fully awaken that memory. So every cell vibrates with that memory. So it's not being brought on the account of, oh, I forgot my nature today whilst I was brushing my teeth. I looked at myself intently and I tried to remind myself who I am. No. It's simply self-evident on the account of fully rekindled and awakened cellular memory, which every cell already vibrates with, carries in itself. This is the loftiest aspiration behind these teachings. Not a fraction, not an iota of thought energy is required, because it's not at the expense of memorizing or remembering who we are. Then being is lived at the fullness, at its fullness. This is also what it means to stand as consciousness. Supreme autonomy. State of freedom, svatantriya. independence from the causes. With that comes clear understanding that whatever is meant to be experienced at the individual level then organically and naturally is already accepted without necessity to summon up some psychological strength to bury anything, to carry anything, to go through anything. Because it is not based on the acceptance of the individual in relation to one's karma. You see the difference? It's no longer on the account of that religious, slightly, it always has that religious connotation. You know, why my life is like this? Well, guess what? Because you deserve it. That's a religious perspective. A more playful attitude is invited here. A more playful, more light-hearted. You know, what if the role is like that? In a Shakespearean play, that role meant to be like that. You know, without Ophelia drowning herself and Hamlet going nuts, where is the beauty? Beauty of Shakespeare? Where's the profundity? This is what I meant, is that every picture is recreated. Nothing is painted by someone and then suddenly being enjoyed by you. Every time you look at something, every time any of us looking, hearing, anything, smelling, sensing, we are recreating reality at the infinitesimal level. This is another profound understanding that is inseparable in the way reality is spoken about in the Shaiva Tantras of Kashmir, is that there is no linear continuity of the way the world is, but the world collapses into nothing and reemerges into existence at infinitesimally, unimaginably subtle level. And that's what it means, pulsating reality. This is the deepest meaning of the term spanda, the throb at the heart of perception. So there is no such thing as there's fossils in rocks in the mountains millions of years. This is a linear perspective in time. This world has never been created according to Kashmir Shaivism and will never cease to exist, but rather it is created, sustained and dissolved at infinitesimal level, and the spiritual insights give direct access to that. Every act of perception is a recreation of something. And it can be at a very local, if you will, so-called innocent, insignificant way, down to recreation of the entire universe, all depending on how much consciousness and awareness is available at a given moment in time to this experience. So these are the categories for you to play with on your own. These are the categories for you to ponder on. so that we come out of that confinement of, that I'm individual going about my daily affairs, about my world. Then there's this, there's country, there's flags, there's political systems, economical systems, there are governments. There's only one government, and that government is governed by your own awareness in your own self, by yourself. So the more consciousness here is, the more expansion, the more ascent there is, the more impact in that dynamic relationship between subject and object. Therefore, awakening of consciousness is the only solution to any perceived problem. This is also to come out of that misconception or misunderstanding of how spiritual practices, spiritual, let's say, methodologies and spiritual revelation sits with the necessity of time. And you have heard the term spiritual activism, which now being coined and becoming quite a hot currency in the global spiritual market. And very often, if it is not given a proper treatment, can cause a lot of misconception along with a sense of guilt that sitting on a cushion is a waste of time while the house is on fire. If there is not enough understanding, and if this understanding is partial, then indeed all this spiritual endeavor can be just a passing of time, just like some kind of self-indulgence. And that's how it is spoken of, I hear very often, by notorious spokespersons that hold attention of the audience. And the term spiritual activism causes this unease. Whereas the word activism is inseparable from the word action. All action stems from thinking. All action. With no exception. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what action is. It comes from the level of thinking. How cultured is our thinking. And all our thinking, of course, is rooted in being. So it is the other way around. Bringing back the Bhagavad Gita, there is this useful reminder. What is action? What is inaction? Declares Krishna in his responses to Arjuna in the chapter on the Karma Yoga, in the Yoga of Action. What is action? What is inaction? Even the wise are bewildered. Krishna's response. And then further there is elaboration. The wise sees action in inaction and inaction in action. This needs to be understood at the deepest level of your most honest, sincere introspection. Because the real movement which moves the continents and the planets and the orbits is not at the level of superficial horizontal thinking, where we reshuffle things and then jump into actions, thinking that that brings somehow solutions. It only causes more reshuffling and causes more agitation, even if it goes by most noble of terms, spiritual activism, etc. But the real action comes from a place where our thinking is anchored in being. When beingness is lived, one may not lift a finger and one moves mountains, or mountains move by themselves more likely. So this of course is not some kind of bravura or wishful thinking or a self-justifying attitude. This, of course, only true if our spiritual enterprise really, really bears fruits, and if we truly, truly given to the process, and this process is in full swing. Because, of course, otherwise, there's a lot of pretenses can take place. And we're not speaking about it in this context. Obviously, it's not spoken about this in terms of escapism. Spirituality is also now being given that, if you will, bill, taxing. How long have you sat on your mat? 30 years, and the world is still collapsing. You haven't done your job. Oh my God, what have I done? You know. Indeed, I spent all my life meditating, but it seems like that's also fragmented understanding. The balance is constantly maintained. If you didn't sit for 30 years on the mat, the world would have already finished existing long time ago. It would have formed into something else, deformed. Whatever, everything is possible in the field of pure potentiality. But maintaining that balance is the real job of why the fifth point of our body hits the cushion.